Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to State's Edition of RE304, where I take old stories I've narrated and update into modern audio standards. This particular story is called The House in the Trees, written by Hicks Kim.
They're not like the Varad, you know. The Varad will surrender when presented with imminent death. They're more civilized in that way. The Varad will lay down their arms and die peacefully, or perhaps allow themselves a glimmer of hope that they'll be spared and allowed to live.
Goral chewed on the end of his straw, a habit he'd picked up during his time with humans. A good storyteller would often chew on the end of their straw, punctuating the story with brief moments of silence, as though they were recording the details carefully. And Goral wished to be a good storyteller this evening.
"I've heard that they're all savages," said a small creature seated nearby. "I heard that they eat their enemies' flesh."
Goral surveyed the room. His entrance, not that long ago, had caused a bit of a distraction amongst the usual patrons of the spa. He was one of the few Arati who had been at the last battle of Earth, when the humans had made their final, glorious stand against the swarm of Durik's brood warriors. He fixed his eyes on the small creatures that spoken, a glipper labourer, and pulled the straw from his mouth.
"You hear only the diluted and twisted and diffused stories that travel from star to star. A single human bites the carapace off a Durik's throne, and the next thing you know, the whole galaxy thinks they're monsters. Allow me to set a record straight for you."
He took a deep swig of his drink, noting with some pleasure that his time amongst the humans had given him a bit of resistance to ethanol-based beverages.
"They are absolutely monsters, without question. Humans are the most terrifying beings in the galaxy. But hear me out. I'll tell you of my time on Earth."
Pads on every table lit up as patrons ordered drinks to settle in for the story. Stories were always great entertainment between systems at way stations like these, but ones about the humans were a rare treat.
"I was supposed to be learning about the humans. They had only recently been invited into the Galactic Federation, and they had welcomed delegations from every race. When I arrived, I met with a human named Jeff. Jeff shook my manipulator in his hand by the way of standard human greeting, and then he led me to the ground vehicle he called a Chevy, which I later learned was an abbreviation for the formal name of a corporate entity that specialized in the manufacture of ground vehicles. We departed the spaceport after the necessary checks of paperwork, and he began driving us towards his home, which was set in some of the largest trees that you can imagine. He pointed out perhaps a dozen different species of trees as we passed them by, and I could barely keep up with my notes. He must have noticed me attempting to recall the information that he was giving me, because he offered to provide me with the full texts on the different plants and animals of the planet. After a short time, we arrived at his home. His mate and their offspring were waiting outside the domicile for our arrival. His mate, a female called Terry, possibly a reference to their world's common name for terror, exposed her mandibles in greeting. It was a wholly unnerving sight, but fortunately I had read the latest intelligence on human body language. This was a smile, and it was intended to be an indication of happiness and amusement.
A voice from the back of the bar grunted,
"We know what a smile is, Arati. Get on with it."
A few other patrons looked around for the source of the voice. It appeared to be a hooded figure hidden in the shadows near the exit. Goral grunted and continued.
"Anyway, I spent the better part of a standard interval there with Jeff and Terry and their offspring, Maisie and Jack. Jack was barely a local cycle old when I arrived, but he grew quickly. Maisie was a few cycles already and was highly inquisitive, even for a human child. Each day was met with new questions about other worlds and other races, and I thought my own offspring would be her friends. Jeff and Terry were always welcoming and seemed to enjoy being able to explain the intricacies of human life and society to me during the daily nutritional supplementals. I was quite content in my position there on Earth. My periodic reports were well received by my superiors, and my hosts were always pleasant to me. It was because of this that I was saddened when I received orders from my immediates to return to Atrax by any means necessary. I sent quick communications to some of my fellow researchers on the planet to determine if they received similar orders. All 218 of my fellow emissaries had received the same command. Most were already on their way to the nearest departure points. It was the Durex. Our sensors had picked up their signatures, and it was clear that they were coming to Earth. A few hushed whispers rippled through the bar, punctuated once by a loud spluttering sound near the exit. The hooded figure had expelled something to the ground. I mentioned this to Jeff and Terry, who nodded their heads sadly. They knew the Durax were coming, but there simply weren't enough ships to evacuate the humans from the planet. Remember, they had only just entered the Galactic Federation, so Jeff and Terry and Maisie and Jack were all condemned to die in the onslaught of the Durex. They insisted that I still had to leave, but I couldn't. I had, at this point, spent a large portion of my life with these humans. I'd observed as Jack obtained self-mobility and developed communication skills. I was there when they both began attending their educational facilities on a regular basis, carried to and from by a large yellow vehicle. I was there when a neighboring family's offspring invited Maisie to a social ritual called prom. I was there when Jack informed his parents that he was joining their military, because everyone might not be as nice as Corell. I was there when a man in green brought a folded piece of cloth to Jeff and Terry, and told them that Jack would not be returning home. I was there for their tiny, short lifetime, and I could not bring myself to abandon them now. Perhaps their human stubbornness had rubbed off on me, to use their words. So we waited in that house in the trays, and the Durex came. They washed over the face of Earth, killing billions upon billions of humans. They were terrifying to the humans, the swarm of darkness that consumed everything in their path. Then, a few days after landing, some of the drones found their way to the house in the trays. They broke down the door and opened fire with their disruptors, hitting Terry and Maisie. They were standing beside me, and I remember feeling fear for the first time as they fell. They seemed so small and fragile in that moment, and I felt my insides twisting in pain at the sight. Jeff saw it too, saw them fall, and I know it broke him. He grabbed a lamp off the nearby table and swung it at the closest drone. I always believed Durex drone exoskeletons were nearly indestructible. Turns out you just need a human with nothing left but hate. The drone's head exploded, splattering the ichor across the walls. The other drones were shocked by the violence of it, and they couldn't react fast enough. Jeff grabbed the fallen drone's disruptor and fired it at the others. When the energy cell was drained, he had one drone left alive. I just tried crawling away, and Jeff was just standing there. I thought perhaps the adrenaline I heard so much about had finally managed to kill Jeff. I had to do something. I picked up the axe from beside the door. Jeff had been chopping firewood earlier in the day, and I lifted it as high as I could. It was incredibly heavy, but I managed well enough. Earth's gravity is considerably greater than most of our own planets, but I'd spent enough time there that I was able to resist its effects for nearly a full cycle before I needed to rest. I held the axe over the drone and released it. The sharpened edge punctured right through the filthy creature, and it screeched as it died. It didn't feel like enough, though. I pulled the axe out of the ground and lifted it again and dropped it again. I must have done it a dozen times before I felt Jeff's hand on my back. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He didn't really have any of the expressions that I'd grown used to seeing. He just said, "Save it for the rest of them," and picked up every disruptor he could find. He handed me one plus a few extra battery cells and started walking back the way the drones had come. I looked back at Maisie and Terry and felt such a sadness in me. I had no other choice now but to follow Jeff to wherever he was going. Gorell drained the last few drops of his drink,
and found that another had been placed before him while he spoke. He transferred his straw from the empty glass to the full one and continued. Jeff and I walked through those trees for several hours before we met up with a cluster of humans. When they saw Jeff, they raised disruptors of their own in greeting. A few looked at me with hostility until Jeff told them simply that I was with him. They nodded and made a space for me around their fire. Jeff didn't sit. He asked which way the nearest drone dropship was. They pointed in the direction that we'd been traveling. Jeff kept walking. I scrambled to keep up with him. I realized what he intended to do, and I spent as much energy as I could spare trying to convince him that suicide was not a solution. After several hours of my attempts to stop him, he finally spoke. It's not suicide, Gorell. I'm already dead. My family is all dead, and I have nothing left to lose. So I'm going to take as many of these things with me as I can. Those were the last words Jeff said to me. Gorell stared at the table in silence. None of the patrons made a sound, save for the sipping of their own drinks. We got to where one of their dropships was, and we saw swarms massed outside, preparing for a final scouring of the planet. Jeff started firing his disruptor at them, and I followed his lead. They started surrounding us, and Jeff pressed his back to mine, tossing me a second disruptor. We were both firing in every direction, and the Juriks were falling like raindrops. There were so many of them. Too many, in fact. Jeff shouted at me, asking if I still wore the personal shielding device that I was standard issue for all non-human visitors to Earth. I had to think about it for a moment. I'd put it on and probably forgotten about it many cycles ago. But I still had it. When I give the signal, you have to activate it, he said to me. The Juriks were swarming us, pushing harder and faster. The disruptors could barely keep up as it was. With the shield up, I can't fire, I shouted back. The Juriks were so close that I could smell their stale breath in the air. Trust me, Jeff shouted. Do it now! I pressed the button, and I felt the shield go up around me. I could do nothing but stare as the Juriks swarmed over us both. They couldn't penetrate the energy shield around me, but I could still see and hear everything. Jeff smiled at me as dozens of Juriks crawled over him, biting and scratching at him, trying to bring him down. I lost sight of him. The last thing I saw was the barrel of his disruptor pressed against the extra battery packs he'd strapped to his chest. Several of the patrons gasped or otherwise expressed shock and amazement. I regained consciousness later. I don't know how long after. The same humans we had encountered earlier had found me, unconscious, with a burned-out shield generator, laying beside Jeff and surrounded by thousands of dead Jurix drones. Jeff's last act had been to slaughter as many Jurix as he could, and the blast was big enough to hit the Queen on the dropship just as she'd begun to command her drones to move out. It was enough to break their lines, and the word spread quickly to the humans that remained. Suicidal runs had been made at every single dropship in the world. Airplanes of all shapes and sizes had been intentionally flown into the ships, breaking them open. Crazed humans from every part of the planet had taken anything they could find to attack the dropships and go for the queens inside. You see, humans as a whole believed that they were doomed. I have learned this in my time since then. When humans feel there is no option left but death, they join Death's team and bring as many along for the trip as they can. Before the Jurix arrived, Earth had a population of over 12 billion humans. Current estimates put them at around 200 million remaining. The humans felt they had nothing left to lose, just as my friend Jeff did. Believe me when I tell you that a human with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in this galaxy. And the human race with nothing to lose, well, if it doesn't scare you, you haven't been paying attention. What about Terry and Maisie? By the time I got back to the house to perform the human burial rituals, the bodies were already gone. I found a mound of freshly turned dirt not far away, so I assumed one of the other humans had already done it. Thanks for the drinks. Goral stood up from his table, and the other patrons respectfully moved aside as he left. quickly whispering amongst themselves about the story they'd just heard. Gorell moved to the exit.
That's a fine story, Ratty, but I'd like to see some proof. Got the mark?
The hooded figure was still wreathed in shadow, but the voice was clear and steady. Gorell stopped and turned to face the figure. I don't think I know you, stranger. Who are you?
You find that out when I see the mark.
Gorell felt his insides twisting again. He'd been tattooed by the humans that found him on the field. They all wore the same tattoo on their right arms, and they had insisted that his part in the fighting had earned him such a mark. Gorell pulled down a piece of fabric, revealing a pair of white wings, with a pair of green reapers over them. The words, "The damned stand ready," were written beneath the image. The hooded figure leaned close to inspect it. From within the folds of cloth, a thin white hand emerged and gently touched the tattoo. Gorell stepped back in surprise. Do you think your offspring will be my friends, Gorell? The white hands pulled back the hood and lowered the cloth from the face, revealing a very old female human with white hair. Gorell could only stare. I didn't die in the house that day, Gorell. Mama pushed me down and took both shots. I was just knocked out. When I came to, you and Daddy were gone. Mama was dead, and there were a whole bunch of dead drones. I've been looking for you ever since then. I thought maybe you died on that field. But then I heard of an Arati with a tattoo, who claimed to have been to Earth, and I had to find you.
Maisie!
Gorell managed to sputter. He extended his manipulator in a customary greeting of the humans, but she pushed it away and hugged him.
How did you get all the way out to this part of the galaxy?
Colony ship. My children and grandchildren and their families are all on the station for the next few days, and then we'll finish the trip out to Porthos 2 and settle. I'm just along for the ride.
You have offspring, Gorell exclaimed. You're alive and you have offspring of your own. You humans truly are unstoppable.
Maisie laughed and stood up slowly, raising herself on a cane leaning against the wall. That we are. Well, you'd best come along and meet them, Gorell. I got me a grandson named after you, and he'll be excited to meet you. Together they made their way down the corridors of the way station, Gorell still amazed that one of his humans was alive after all that had happened. End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.